It was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of scraping by, I finally earned a scholarship that brought me to Mexico City. The campus was a vibrant place, alive, colorful, chaotic in the best ways. But my budget didn't stretch far, so I ended up renting a small apartment near Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco. The building was a boxy concrete structure, cold, faded, and silent. Still, it was close to school, and the rent was cheap. Too cheap in hindsight. The landlord was a man in his late 50s, gaunt and expressionless. He barely said a word as he handed me the keys, only muttering something under his breath as I signed the lease. I thought I caught a word, las voces, but I assumed I'd misunderstood. I didn't ask him to repeat it. The apartment was small, a single bedroom, a bathroom with stained tiles, and a narrow kitchenette. The floor was concrete, and even when I laid down my rugs, the place stayed icy. The windows faced another building's wall. No light ever came in. The first few nights passed without much trouble. I kept busy with classes and studying, and when I came home, I was usually too tired to notice anything odd. But by the end of the first week, things started to change. It began with whispers. I'd be reading in bed, and faint murmurs would drift through the apartment. At first, I thought it was the neighbors, paper-thin walls maybe. But when I pressed my ear to the wall, it was silent. The murmurs came from somewhere else, lower, deeper, from beneath me. One night, I stayed up late working on an essay. Around 2 a.m., I felt the floor beneath my chair vibrate ever so slightly. Then the murmurs returned. This time, they were clearer, dozens of overlapping voices, whispering in a language I didn't understand. I stood up, heart pounding, and crouched to press my ear to the cold concrete floor. There were voices, so many voices, men, women, children, all speaking at once in broken fragments. Some were crying, others sounded angry, some sounded like they were begging. I jumped back, shaking. I told myself it was just pipes, the building settling, maybe even street noise echoing strangely. I tried to sleep with the headphones on. The next day, I asked one of the neighbors, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, if she'd ever heard anything strange at night. Her face went pale. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then she just said, "Don't listen too closely. Don't look too long." That was all. She closed the door in my face. I should have left then. I should have packed my bags, forfeited the deposit, and found a place somewhere else. But I told myself I was imagining. That stress was getting to me. Then came the shadows. I started seeing movement in the corner of my eye, shapes that slid across the floor beneath my feet. When I flipped on the lights, they vanished. I thought I was losing my mind until one night, while brushing my teeth, I dropped something and bent down to pick it up. That's when I saw it clearly. A hand, pressed flat against the underside of the concrete floor. Pale, skeletal fingers, splayed wide, stretching toward me. My breath caught in my throat. I scrambled backward, nearly slipping. There was nothing there. The next few nights were a blur of panic. Every time I lay in bed, I could hear scratching beneath the mattress. Sometimes it was faint tapping, sometimes frantic clawing. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I didn't go to class anymore. One night, I decided I needed proof. I borrowed a thermal camera from a student in the engineering department. I set it up beside my bed, pointed at the floor, and left it recording overnight. What I saw the next morning shattered me. At exactly 3:13 a.m., the floor temperature shifted drastically. Glowing outlines, hands, feet, faces, appeared beneath the surface. Dozens, moving slowly, as if pacing just beneath me. Some stared directly upward, their features barely distinguishable, warped, but unmistakably human. One face in particular pressed against the floor, its mouth opened and closed as if it were screaming. That day I confronted the landlord. I showed him the footage. He watched in silence, then finally spoke. "This building is built on bones. They never let us forget." I demanded answers, but he only shook his head. He said something about the massacre, the students, the dead buried without names, without peace. Their bodies, he claimed, were never properly exhumed before the complex was built. He didn't say it directly, but I understood. They were still there, underneath us, beneath my room. I tried to leave that night, but when I opened my door, the hallway was gone. Instead, there was a tunnel, dark, damp, stretching endlessly in both directions. I turned around. My apartment had disappeared, replaced by a featureless concrete wall. I screamed. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. Eventually, I woke up in my bed, just like that. The hallway was normal again. My door opened like nothing had happened. I left everything behind that morning and moved into a crowded student dorm, sharing a room with 3 other people. I didn't care. I just needed people around me. Noise, life, anything but silence and concrete. But some nights, when everything is quiet, I still feel the floor beneath me vibrate. I still hear faint whispers. And sometimes, when I wake up suddenly in the dark, I see the outline of a face beneath the bed staring up at me. I never believed in curses. Superstition wasn't something I entertained, not growing up in a family of rational thinkers, all engineers and doctors. But what happened to me in Mexico City that summer tore every ounce of logic from my mind and left something else in its place. Something darker, something I still can't explain without my voice trembling. I was 23 and had just landed a freelance photography gig. My assignment was simple: capture images of old, decaying buildings around the historic districts for a magazine piece about urban decay. It sounded fascinating, romantic even. But that's before I walked into the house on Calle Violeta. The house didn't look any different from the others. Chipped paint, rusted gates, windows covered with sun-bleached curtains. It had been abandoned for years. A leftover of the old days, my guide mumbled, before giving me the address and walking away, like he wanted nothing to do with the place. I remember thinking how odd it was that he didn't even offer to accompany me, just handed me the location and left without a second glance. I arrived late afternoon. The sky was dull, heavy with clouds, and the city noise seemed to thin out as I approached the house. It felt too quiet. I pushed the gate open. It gave a shriek loud enough to wake the dead. The front door, surprisingly, wasn't locked. Just a simple turn of the knob, and I was inside. Dust coated everything. The air was thick and musty. Each breath felt like swallowing soot. I raised my camera and began snapping shots. The staircase, the shattered chandelier, the peeling wallpaper that revealed long-forgotten patterns beneath. But then, something caught my eye. A door under the stairs. It was small and narrow, almost child-sized, and half hidden behind a curtain of cobwebs. I felt a strange pull toward it, an uncomfortable curiosity, like a whisper in the back of my mind saying, "Look inside." So I did. Behind the door was a narrow hallway, far longer than it should have been. It sloped downward, leading deep underground. No light fixtures, no windows. I should have turned around then, but instead I pulled out my phone's flashlight and stepped inside. Each step echoed beneath my feet, and the deeper I went, the colder it became. The walls grew damp. Mold clung to the corners. The air began to carry a scent I still can't fully describe. Something like iron, mildew, and something else. Something sickly sweet. Something wrong. After several minutes, I reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was wooden, ancient, with strange carvings burned into its surface, symbols I didn't recognize. I raised my camera and took a photo. The flash illuminated the entire space, but the screen went black. The camera froze. That's when I heard it. A low humming sound, soft and rhythmic, like a lullaby sung through gritted teeth. I turned around, expecting to see someone behind me, but I was alone, or I thought I was. As I stepped back toward the door, something shifted in the dark. A shape, tall and narrow, stood at the far end of the hall, back where I'd come from. My flashlight flickered, but I saw enough to know it wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid, like it had been standing still for centuries. I didn't wait to see more. I ran. I slammed into walls, scraped my arms, dropped my flashlight, but I didn't stop. I finally burst back into the house, slammed the small door shut behind me, and staggered out into the street. I thought it was over, but that night, I developed the photos from earlier and froze when I saw the image I'd taken just before the camera. The photograph showed the carved door perfectly, but behind it, something was peeking out. A face, gaunt, eyeless, twisted with a grin that stretched ear to ear. The skin looked like it had rotted, but the mouth was fresh, wet, open. After that night, everything started to unravel. I began seeing figures in reflection, behind me in windows, in the corner of my laptop screen, even in the glare on my phone. Always just out of focus, always watching. The humming returned, sometimes loud enough to wake me in the middle of the night. I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself it was stress, trauma, maybe carbon monoxide poisoning. But then my neighbor knocked on my door one night, terrified. She said she heard humming in her apartment, soft and rhythmic, coming from her walls. She asked if I'd been playing music. I lied and said yes. But a week later, she disappeared. No note, no trace, just vanished. Now I keep my lights on at all hours. I haven't touched my camera since, and yet every time I look into a mirror, I catch glimpses of that grinning face, just for a second, watching me, waiting, like I brought something back from that place, like it followed me out of the hallway under the stairs. I've moved 3 times since, but the humming always finds me. I was never afraid of hospitals. In fact, I always found them oddly comforting. Clean hallways, bright lights, the quiet hum of machines. But that was before I worked a night shift at Hospital del Silencio in the heart of Mexico City. It was supposed to be temporary. I had just finished my nursing internship and needed quick cash before starting a more permanent position. A friend of mine, Carla, recommended this. An old semi-private hospital that mostly handled overnight patient monitoring hospice care, and the occasional trauma case. The pay was great, and the staff was minimal. Too minimal, really. There were barely 5 of us on the entire floor each night. The first night felt strange from the moment I walked in. The building was old, built sometime in the 1950s. The walls were yellowed, and the fluorescent lights flickered with that eerie stutter that makes everything feel colder. The air was too still, too heavy, like the building was holding its breath. They assigned me to the East Wing, room 304 to 310. Simple tasks, nothing complicated. I made rounds, checked vitals, handed out medication, and recorded everything in the dusty logbook they insisted we use. But by 3 a.m., I was sitting at the nurse's station with nothing to do. That's when I noticed something odd. Room 306 was always locked. I had keys for every room in the wing, except 306. I asked Carla about it, but she just shrugged and said, "We don't use that room anymore. Just leave it alone." Her voice was clipped, like she didn't want to talk about it. I pushed a little, asking why, but she looked at me dead in the eye and said, "Because some doors shouldn't be opened, especially in this place." That should have been enough to scare me off. But curiosity has a way of digging its claws into your mind. That same night, while making another round, I paused outside room 306. The door was heavy and dark, with peeling numbers and a faded sign that looked like it had been scratched off. As I turned to leave, I heard a sound from inside, barely audible but distinct, crying. It was faint, muffled, like someone sobbing into a pillow. My first instinct was to check it out, but I didn't have the key. I even went back to the front desk to see if there was a spare, but the drawer where the extra keys were kept was locked, and no one had the key for that either. The crying continued every night. Sometimes it was weeping. Sometimes it sounded like a child, whispering words I couldn't understand. One night, it sounded like someone laughing softly. Not joyful laughter, something else. Something cracked and hollow. I started avoiding that hallway. I'd do my rounds faster, keep my head down, pretend I didn't hear anything. But the worst part came on my 6th night. I was filling out a report at the nurse's station when the light above room 306 started flickering rapidly, faster than any other light in the hallway. I got up to check, but before I even reached the door, it stopped. Then I noticed something even more disturbing. The logbook was open on its own, and a name was written on the page in shaky, jagged handwriting. Elena Vargas, room 306, 3:11 a.m. No one by that name had been admitted, and I certainly hadn't written it. When I asked Carla, she turned pale and said nothing for a full minute. Then she whispered, "That name hasn't been said in years." I demanded she tell me the truth, and reluctantly she did. Elena Vargas had been a patient in room 306 10 years ago, a psychiatric case, heavily sedated, constantly claiming she saw things in the mirrors, people with no eyes crawling on the ceiling, whispering her name through the walls. She had been committed after a violent breakdown, and one night, during her final week of evaluation, she attacked 2 nurses and hung herself from the ceiling fan using strips of her bedsheet. But when they found her body, her eyes had been removed, scooped cleanly from their sockets. No tool, no blood on the floor, just 2 perfect, empty hollows in her face. The case was never explained. The coroner even said it looked like the eyes had never existed to begin with. They sealed the room afterward, but some staff still heard her crying. Some saw her reflection in the mirrors, even though the room had none. I should have quit then. I should have run and never looked back. But something about it pulled me in deeper. The final night I worked there, I saw her. I was making my last round before my shift ended. I paused outside room 306. The air was colder than usual. I turned to leave, but the door creaked open, just an inch. No one had ever opened it before. The key was gone. The room had no power, but it was open. Against every instinct, I stepped inside. The room was empty, bare walls, no bed, no equipment. Just an old, dust-covered mirror leaning against the far wall. And in the mirror, I saw her. She stood behind me, eyes missing, bloodless hollows where they should have been. Her mouth was open, a twisted grin. Her arms hung lifeless at her sides. She didn't move, but I felt her breath on my neck. I ran. When I reached the hallway, the door slammed shut behind me so hard the light fixtures shook. I quit the next morning. I still see her sometimes, when I pass by a hospital, or when I catch my reflection in a window at night. Just a flash, just a flicker. But every now and then, when I dream, I'm back in that room. The crying starts again. The logbook opens on its own. And my name is written under hers. I've always loved bookstores. There's something comforting about the scent of old paper and the silence that lingers between the shelves. After moving to Mexico City for a new job, I found a quaint little shop tucked between 2 crumbling buildings on a street that rarely saw much foot traffic. The sign above the door read, "Libreria del Alma," Bookstore of the Soul. It was the kind of place that felt hidden, forgotten by time. I discovered it on a rainy afternoon when my umbrella flipped inside out and I ducked into the first doorway. The air inside was warm and thick, with the scent of aged parchment and binding glue. A bell above the door gave a soft chime, but no one greeted me. The shop was empty, except for rows upon rows of tall wooden shelves that stretched toward a ceiling lost in shadows. There was something strange about the way the books were. No signs, no genres, no labels. Some titles were in Spanish, others in Latin, and a few in languages I couldn't even begin to recognize. Strange symbols, jagged runes, writing that twisted in on it. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt drawn to a particular section near the back of the store. It was colder there, like a draft was slipping through the cracks in the wall. The books in this section looked older, more worn, as if they had been handled hundreds of times. One book caught my attention immediately. It was bound in black leather, thick and heavy, with no title on the cover. I reached for it, and the instant my fingers touched the spine, I felt a sharp jolt run up my arm, like static, only deeper, more internal. I pulled my hand back, startled, but curiosity won out. I opened it. There were no printed words inside, only handwritten entries, names, dates, and detailed accounts, like journal entries or confession. The first page read, Maria Calderón, 1893. He watches from every entry was different, but each one grew progressively darker. People claiming to be haunted, cursed, stalked by things only they could see. One spoke of shadows that whispered, another of a voice that spoke through cracks in the walls. The last few entries didn't even look human, just frantic scribbles and symbols etched into the page like claw marks. I was about to close it when I noticed something chilling. There was a new entry being written right before my eyes. My name, the date, the exact time, and a sentence underneath it. She heard the voice. Now it knows her name. I dropped the book and stepped back, heart pounding, but there was no one around. The store was still silent. I turned to leave, but the doorway was gone. I spun around in panic. The shelves seemed taller, darker. The space felt warped, stretched. I ran to where the front door had been, but all I saw was more shelves, endless rows of them. The shop had shifted like it was alive. That's when I heard the whisper. It came from behind the shelves, a soft, wet sound like breath sliding through teeth. I turned and saw movement in the shadows, a figure hunched and faceless, crawling between the gaps in the shelves. It didn't walk. It dragged itself, limbs too long, body folding unnaturally. Its presence sucked the warmth from the air. I ran. I didn't know where, just forward, past books with titles that blurred as I passed them, past shelves that twisted like roots. I finally stumbled into a clearing, a small reading nook with a single table and a mirror hanging on the wall. In the mirror, I saw myself, but not alone. The thing was behind me, standing still, grinning without a face. I turned around. Nothing. But when I looked again, my reflection was still being watched. That thing never left them. Even when I backed away, even when I turned in circles, in every reflective surface since, mirrors, windows, even puddles, I see it, just standing there, staring at me through the glass. Eventually, I found the exit. Or rather, it found me. One moment I was trapped in the maze, and the next, I stumbled out into the street. It was night. The rain had stopped. The street was empty. I turned around. The bookstore was gone, no door, no sign, no building, just a blank wall between two shops, as if it had never been there at all. But I know what I saw. I know what I brought back with me. Because every time I walk past a mirror, the reflection lags for just a second too long. And in that flicker of delay, I see it, watching, waiting, closer than ever. I'd always thought of Mexico City as vibrant and alive, buzzing with energy at all hours of the day. But there's a side to this city that few talk about, a side hidden in shadows and silence. I discovered it when I moved into a cheap rental apartment in the older part of the city, near a decaying structure everyone called La Casa del Silencio. The apartment itself wasn't much, just 2 rooms, a kitchenette, and a bathroom, but it was what I could afford. My neighbors were distant, the walls were thin, and every floorboard creaked like it carried the weight of 100 years. But I didn't mind. I had just started a new job at a publishing house and needed a place to crash, nothing more. It was during my second week there that I first noticed the noise. At exactly 2:14 a.m., every night, I'd hear scratching on my bedroom wall, the one that faced the old abandoned house next door. Not faint, distant scratching either. This was close, sharp, deliberate, like fingernails clawing from the other side of the wall, and every night it would last exactly 13 minutes. I timed it. I tried everything, earplugs, music, sleeping pills, but the scratching always bled through, slow and rhythmic, like a countdown. One night I finally snapped and decided to investigate. I stepped outside, into the narrow alley between my building and the abandoned house. The structure loomed tall and decrepit, its windows shattered, its wooden beams exposed like ribs. The front gate was wrapped in rusted chains, but there was a hole in the fence around the back. Curiosity pushed me through. The inside of the house was a time capsule. Dust coated every surface, torn wallpaper peeled like rotting skin. There were signs of former life, old dolls, broken dishes, faded photographs left on crooked walls. But what unsettled me the most was the mirror in the main hallway. It was massive, taller than me, with a heavy, ornate frame carved with strange symbols I didn't recognize. The glass was fogged, almost like it was breathing, and there, in that mirror, I saw something I still can't explain. It was me, standing perfectly still, but my reflection was scratching the wall behind it. I wasn't moving. I wasn't even touching anything, but my reflection dragged its nails along the mirrored wall, slowly, deliberately, over and over. I backed away, horrified, but the reflection continued even as I turned and ran. From that night on, things got worse. I began waking up with scratches on my arms and legs, deep and red like fingernail marks. I'd hear whispering in my sleep, words I didn't understand, murmured right beside my ear. The mirror in my bathroom started fogging up on its own, even when the room wasn't humid, and sometimes when I wiped it clean, there were handprints on the other side. I tried to tell my landlord. He just looked at me and said, "You should never have gone into that house." When I pressed him, he finally told me the story. Decades ago, La Casa del Silencio belonged to a woman named Inez Morales, a recluse who was rumored to be a medium. People said she could speak with spirits through mirrors, that she could summon the dead using reflection. But something went wrong. One night, her neighbors heard her screaming. When they broke in, they found her sprawled in front of the large hallway mirror, blood leaking from her eyes, ears, and mouth. The mirror was untouched. No blood, no cracks, just her reflection grinning back as her real body lay still. Since then, everyone who lived near that house claimed to hear scratching. Some said they saw Ines in their mirrors. Others vanished altogether, leaving behind only fogged-up glass and claw marks. I moved out a week later. I didn't care about the lease, the deposit, nothing. I just packed what I could and left. But the mirror in my new apartment, sometimes, late at night, I see a figure behind me, a shadow that doesn't belong. And once, just once, when I looked away for a second and looked back, my reflection was still staring at me, smiling. I don't know what I brought with me. I don't know if it's still her or something else that came through that mirror. But whatever it is, it hasn't stopped scratching. There are places in Mexico City where history hangs thick in the air, where old buildings wear the weight of forgotten tragedy. I never believed those stories until I started working the night shift at a vintage hotel in the historic center. It was an old colonial era building, restored to look elegant, but beneath the fresh paint and polished wood, you could feel its age in your bones. I was hired as a night receptionist. It sounded simple. Check in late guests, answer calls, monitor the cameras. Quiet work, decent pay. The first few nights were uneventful, even peaceful. The halls were dimly lit, the creaky elevator rarely moved, and the guests mostly kept to themselves. But on my sixth night, something strange happened. Around 3:11 a.m., the lobby phone. When I picked up, no one answered. Just a faint static, like wind howling through a tunnel. I waited a moment, thinking it was a glitch, before I heard it. A distant voice whispering in a slow, shaky tone, "She's walking the fourth floor again." Then the line went dead. There was only one problem. We didn't have a fourth floor. The hotel had only 3. I checked the call log, but it showed nothing. No incoming call, no internal extension, just a blank line. I brushed it off. Maybe it was a prank. But that same night, the elevator started moving on its own, up and down, doors opening and closing without a button pressed. When I checked the security camera feed, I froze. The elevator was empty. But as the doors opened on the non-existent 4th floor, the display showed 4, clearly glowing in red. Then, for just a second, the lobby lights flickered, and I saw her, a woman in a black dress, standing in the reflection of the elevator door. Her hair hung down over her face. She didn't move, didn't step out, just stood there, her head tilted slightly, like she was listening. Then everything went dark. When the lights came back on, the display returned to lobby, and the woman was gone. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination. The next morning, I talked to the day receptionist. I asked if anything strange had ever happened during his shift. He hesitated, then leaned closer. "You saw her, didn't you?" I didn't need to answer. He nodded slowly. "She's part of this. They say she used to be a guest here back in the 1950s. Her name was Elena Vargas, honeymoons, but her husband vanished on their wedding night, disappeared without a trace. They searched every room, every inch of the hotel, until someone noticed the elevator had a strange glitch. It would sometimes stop at a non-existent floor. People started saying Elena never left, that she's still looking for him. He paused. But the worst part? Guests who see her eventually disappear too. I didn't believe it, not really. But things got worse every night. Shadows moved in hallways where no one stood. The elevator stopped at 4 more often. Once, a guest ran screaming from their room, claiming they woke up with Elena standing over them, whispering, "Have you seen him?" Security footage showed their room door never opened. And then came the night I tried to leave. I had decided I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things, called my supervisor, and handed over my resignation. But before I could walk out, the elevator dinged behind me, floor 4. The doors slid open, revealing a corridor I had never seen before. Old wallpaper, flickering lights, peeling carpet. And at the end of the hallway, Elena was waiting. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Then, one by one, every light in the corridor began to go out, closer and closer, until only she remained, bathed in shadows. I ran, not just from the hotel, but from that part of the city. I moved across town, took another job, and avoided every elevator for months. But now, even in my apartment, strange things have started again. A call at 3:11 a.m., no number, no voice, just a whisper. He's still missing. And sometimes in my mirror, I swear I see her standing, watching, waiting, lost between floors. I had never considered Mexico City a place of silence. It's a city of motion, of horns and voices and street vendors yelling at dawn. But there was one neighborhood on the far outskirts, an odd little enclave called San Pedro Bajo, that felt eerily removed from that energy. It was where my uncle had lived for most of his life, in a small, crumbling house that always seemed colder than it should have been. When he passed away unexpectedly, I was the only family member willing to handle the house. I didn't really know him. He'd always been distant, a little paranoid, and often spoke of strange things. My parents said he had gone a bit off in his last years, talking about voices in the walls, shadows that moved wrong, things that watched from the trees behind his house. I thought it was just the kind of delusion that come with old age and isolation. I agreed to stay for a few days while a real estate agent prepared it for sale. The first night, I noticed something odd. The house had no mirrors, not a single one. Not in the bathroom, the bedrooms, nowhere. I thought maybe he'd taken them down or broken them. But when I opened a closet in the hallway, I found them. Every mirror in the house, covered in thick black cloths, stacked against each other like a barricade. I pulled one out, unwrapped it. It looked normal, just dusty. I wiped it clean and hung it in the bathroom. That was my first mistake. That night, I was brushing my teeth when I noticed something in the mirror. It was my reflection, but it didn't feel like mine. It blinked slower. Its head tilted just a second too late. I chalked it up to being tired, but when I turned off the light and walked to the bedroom, I glanced one last time. My reflection was still staring. I didn't sleep well that night. I had dreams, deep, suffocating dreams, where I was trapped behind glass, pounding to get out, while a grinning version of myself watched from the other side. The next morning, I started hearing noises, scraping, soft at first, like nails along a wall. It came from the closet where the other mirrors. I opened the door, and every single mirror was uncovered. I know I didn't do it. They weren't just uncovered, they were moved, arranged in a wide circle on the floor, all facing inward. And in the center, the floor was scratched, gouged deep into the wood, in spiraling patterns I couldn't explain. They looked like runes or symbols, something ancient and wrong. I called the real estate agent and told him I was uncomfortable staying there. He sounded surprised. "You're still at the house?" he asked. "We haven't been able to reach you for days." It had only been one night. I checked my phone. The call log was blank. No missed calls, no texts, nothing. Like time had shifted inside the house. That evening, I tried to leave. I packed my things and stepped outside, but something was wrong. The neighborhood was gone, or maybe it had changed. The trees were blackened, leafless. The sky had no stars. The air was still but thick, like breathing fog underwater. I walked down the road and found myself back at the house within minutes. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't taken the same path, but there it was. Same peeling paint, same dim porch light flickering in the windless air. That night, I saw something crawl out of the mirror. It wasn't me. It wore my face, but its movements were twitchy, broken. Its jaw hung slightly open, as if it had never quite figured out how to be human. It crouched, then stood, mimicking how I moved, but wrong, like watching a reflection in a dream you can't wake from. It whispered my name in a cracked voice. Then it walked toward me. I smashed the mirror. Glass exploded across the room, and the thing vanished with a shriek that made the walls tremble. But the next morning, the mirror was whole again. No cracks, no damage, just my reflection, waiting, watching. I fled the house before sunset, walking for hours until I found a passing car and begged for a ride. I told the real estate agent to burn it all, to destroy the mirrors, to tear down the house. But he just laughed nervously and said, "We already sold it. Someone else lives there." But sometimes when I look in my mirror at home, I notice small delays again, little glitches, a flicker of movement that doesn't match mine, a second pair of eyes just out of focus in the background. I think it followed me, and I don't think the mirror is just a reflection anymore. It's a door, and it's still open. It started with a scream. I had just moved to a modest apartment in the Doctores neighborhood of Mexico City, a place known more for its gritty charm than peace and quiet. It was cheap, though, and I needed cheap. I was a university student trying to get by, working evenings at a bookstore and studying at night. The apartment was small, just a bedroom, a bathroom, and a tiny kitchen. But it had one thing I liked, a big window that overlooked the alley behind the building. That first scream came on my third night there. I was lying in bed reviewing notes when I heard it. A woman's scream, sharp and panicked, echoing through the alley. I jumped up, rushed to the window, but saw nothing, just trash bins and a flickering streetlight. A few seconds later, everything fell quiet again. I figured it was a drunk fight, maybe a domestic argument. This was Mexico City. It wasn't unusual. But then it happened again the next night. Same time, around 2:43 a.m. Same scream, same alley. Still, no one was there. This time, I noticed something strange. After the scream, my apartment felt colder, like the air had dropped several degrees. I looked around, even checked the thermostat, but there was no logical explanation. On the fourth night, the scream came again, but this time, it was followed by weeping, a low, shuddering cry that echoed unnaturally, like it was trapped in the walls. That was when I started to get genuinely scared. I tried asking around the building. One of the older neighbors, an old man named Arturo who lived downstairs, gave me a strange look when I brought it up. "You've heard her," he said softly, eyes narrowing. "The one from the alley." He told me a story. Years ago, before the building was remodeled, there had been a tenant, a young woman named Maria Esperanza, who lived in the apartment directly above mine. One night, she was found dead in the alley behind the building. No one knew exactly what happened. Some said she fell. Others said she was pushed. But a few whispered that she jumped, driven mad by something inside the apartment. "They say she screamed before she hit the ground," Arturo said. "Same time, same sound, every night." I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was just an urban legend, some creepy tale passed around by neighbors to scare newcomers. But the nights kept getting worse. The scream was getting closer, louder, like it was coming from inside the building. On the sixth night, the weeping turned into words, broken, muffled phrases. "Help me, please, he's watching me." I couldn't sleep. My nights became a parade of lights on, lights off, pacing the room, covering mirrors, blocking the window. Something was wrong with that apartment. I felt it in my bones. On the seventh night, I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I was sure I had locked it. I went to check the hallway and froze. There were wet footprints leading from the front door to the window, bare feet, small, like a woman. But the door was still locked from the inside. That's when I set up my phone to record the room overnight. I needed proof, something, anything to explain what was happening. The next morning, I watched the footage. For the first 3 hours, nothing happened. But at 2:43 a.m., the screen flickered. Then, a shadow appeared by the window. Not a person, just a silhouette, faint but unmistakable. It moved slowly into the room, gliding as if hovering just above the floor. It stopped at the foot of my bed and stood there, watching me. Then came the scream, loud, piercing. The camera shook violently and cut to static. I moved out the next day. I didn't tell the landlord why. I didn't need a refund, didn't want to argue. I just left, packed what I could carry, and stayed with a friend across the city. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in over a week. But just when I started feeling safe again, it happened. At 2:43 a.m., my friend's window shattered, and from the alley outside, I heard the scream again, louder than ever before, as if it had followed me, as if she wasn't tied to the apartment, but to me. Now, every night, no matter where I go, she screams. I've changed cities, even stayed in another country for a while. But it doesn't matter. She always finds me, and lately, she's not just screaming anymore. She's whispering my name. I was never the kind of person who believed in curses. I'd heard stories growing up in Coyoacan, one of Mexico City's most historic and artsy neighborhoods. Old legends of haunted houses, cursed objects, things you shouldn't bring home. But to me, they were just that, stories. That is, until I bought the painting. It was a small, oil-on-canvas portrait I found at an old antique market, tucked in a narrow street near the plaza. It was buried beneath other forgotten pieces, covered in dust and cobwebs. The vendor, a hunched old woman with cloudy eyes, barely spoke a word, just smiled with yellowed teeth and said, It chooses who it wants. I laughed, thinking she was trying to create some mystique, but something about the painting pulled at me, even though it was deeply unsettling. It depicted a girl in a black dress, standing in a foggy forest. Her face was expressionless, pale and gaunt, eyes wide and dark, almost too large. But it wasn't just her appearance, it was the way she was painted, like her eyes followed you, no matter where you stood. The background was murky, almost unfinished, as if the forest was swallowing her whole. I bought it for 200 pesos. A deal, really, or so I thought. The moment I brought it home, my apartment felt different, heavy, cold, still. I hung the painting in the hallway, but every time I passed it, I swore her expression had changed just slightly, her eyes narrowing, her lips twitching almost imperceptibly. That first night, I dreamt of her. I was standing in the forest from the painting, fog curling around my legs like fingers. The girl was there, silent, unmoving, but now her head was tilted, and she was pointing at something behind me. When I turned around, I saw nothing, just shadows. Then I woke up gasping, heart pounding. The painting had fallen from the wall during the night. At first, I thought it was just badly mounted. I rehung it with proper nails, but the next night it fell again, and again, until I finally gave in and leaned it against the wall in the living room. That's when things got worse. I began hearing soft footsteps at night, always near the painting, and then I started seeing her, not just in dreams, but in the corners of mirrors, reflected in windows, standing at the end of the hallway when I turned the lights off. Every time, just a glimpse, but enough to leave my blood cold. I tried removing the painting from the apartment, but it wouldn't go. I left it outside, only to find it back inside the next morning. I tried burning it, but the flames refused to touch it. It singed the edges, but the canvas itself remained intact, untouched, like the fire curved around it. I started doing research. I returned to the antique market, but the vendor was gone, her stall empty. No one remembered her, but one old man nearby pulled me aside and whispered, "You bought the girl, didn't you?" When I nodded, he made the sign of the cross and said, "There's a reason that painting's been passed around for decades. No one keeps it long. Not if they want to live." He told me a story I wish I hadn't heard. They called her La Niña del Bosque, the forest girl. Legend says she was a child who vanished in the woods near Tepoztlan decades ago. When her body was never found, her grieving mother hired an artist to paint her from memory. But something went wrong. The artist, obsessed with the child, painted not her likeness, but something else, something that came through him. When he finished the painting, he gouged out his eyes and slit his throat. Since then, the painting has been cursed. Every owner reported strange visions, hallucinations, visits in their dreams. Some vanished, some went mad. Others were found dead under mysterious circumstances, with their faces twisted in terror. I tried giving it away, tried selling it online. People responded, interested at first, until they saw the image, then silence. No one would take it. That night, I found a message scratched into my bathroom mirror, "Keep me." Then came the knocking. It started softly from inside the walls, then from the hallway, then from inside my closet. I opened it once and found the painting had moved itself there. The girl's eyes looked different now, angrier, like she was tired of waiting. The last straw came when I woke up to find muddy footprints leading from the hallway to my bed, small, child-sized, and on the wall above my head in the same muddy streaks was the outline of a handprint. I left the apartment that morning and never went back. I moved in with my brother across the city. A week later, he called me into the living room, holding something behind his back. "You forgot something," he said. He pulled it out, and there it was, the painting. I didn't bring it. I swear I didn't. But there it was, back in my life, like a cancer that wouldn't die. It's in storage now, locked in a steel box, buried in a warehouse. I won't disclose. I keep moving, trying to stay one step ahead. But I know she's still watching. I feel her every night. I see her in reflections that shouldn't be there. I hear soft footsteps on wooden floors I no longer live on. And sometimes I dream of the forest again. But this time, I'm not alone. She's closer now, and she's smiling. I never should have taken the taxi. It was late, past 2 a.m., and I had just finished meeting up with friends in Roma Norte, one of Mexico City's liveliest neighborhoods. Normally, I would have called an Uber, but my phone was at 2% battery, and the app refused to load. The streets were mostly empty, except for the occasional stray dog or drunken couple stumbling home. That's when I saw the taxi, a beat-up green and white Vocho, one of those old Volkswagen Beetle cabs that had mostly disappeared from the city. The paint was chipped, and the headlights flickered as it idled near the curb. Something about it made me hesitate. But as I glanced at my phone again, the screen went black. I had no other option. The driver barely looked at me when I got in. He was an older man, thin, with deep wrinkles carved into his face, dressed in an old, buttoned-up jacket. His hands, gripping the steering wheel, were unusually pale. "Where to?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice. I gave him my address in Coyoacan, and he nodded without another word. As soon as the car started moving, I felt it. The air inside was wrong, thick, almost damp, like the windows hadn't been rolled down in years. A faint scent of something rotting lingered in the seats. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to an old car's interior. But then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The meter wasn't running. I cleared my throat. "Hey, do you have a meter?" I asked. The driver didn't respond. Instead, he did something that made my blood run cold. He smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too unnatural, stretching his face in a way that seemed almost inhuman. I swallowed hard. My instincts screamed at me to get out, but we were already speeding down an empty boulevard. The streetlights flickered past in strange, distorted patterns, and that's when I realized something was very wrong with the city outside. The streets were too empty. Mexico City, even at 2 a.m., always had some life. Street vendors, drunks, security guards, late-night workers, but now it was deserted. No cars, no pedestrians, no sound except for the humming of the engine. My breathing quickened. I reached for my phone, hoping to at least pretend to text someone, but when I pressed the power button, the screen didn't turn on. Not even the low battery symbol. It was dead. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something even worse. The rearview mirror. The driver wasn't looking at the road. He was staring at me. But his eyes, they weren't human. They were pure black, like two gaping voids, stretching too wide, as if there was nothing inside but darkness. Panic surged through me. I had to get out. Now I gripped the door handle and yanked, locked. The driver's smile widened. "Almost there," he whispered. I didn't wait. I slammed my foot against the door, again and again, but the lock wouldn't budge. The street outside looked wrong now, like the buildings were warping, stretching taller. The streetlights flickering between red and black, casting shadows that didn't match the car's movement. I looked back at the driver, and he was changing. His skin darkened, twisting, his features warping like melted wax. His hands on the steering wheel elongated, the fingers too long, the nails too sharp. The car, once old and rusty, now felt like a cage, closing in. I screamed. Then, a horn blared. Bright lights flashed, and suddenly, impact. The car jerked violently, spinning. The sound of crushing metal, glass shattering, and then darkness. When I woke up, I was lying on the pavement, my head throbbing. A small crowd had gathered. Someone, a man in a security uniform, was shaking my shoulder. "Senor, are you okay?" he asked. I blinked. The taxi was gone. No wreckage, no tire marks. Just the faint scent of rotting flesh, lingering in the air. I told the police what happened. They looked at each other, then at me, before one of them sighed and said, "Otro más," another one. That's when I learned about La Taxicina, the ghost taxi of Mexico City. For decades, people had reported getting into taxis late at night, only to realize the driver wasn't human. Some vanished forever. Others were found wandering miles away from where they entered, dazed, confused, unable to recall how they escaped. The worst part? When I checked my bank transactions the next morning, I saw a charge for a taxi ride at exactly 2:13 a.m., but I never gave the driver my card. It was supposed to be a fresh start. After a rough breakup and the collapse of my job contract, I moved to a quiet neighborhood in San Andres Mixquic, one of Mexico City's lesser-known districts, peaceful, slow-paced, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life passed like a whisper. I found a charming little house on the outskirts, cheap rent, modest structure, and a view of the ancient cemetery that made the neighborhood famous every Dia de los Muertos. At first, I liked the peace, the silence, the way the town breathed with history and folklore. But I soon realized that silence had teeth. It started with the scratching, faint at first, like rats in the walls. I tried traps, poison, even called a pest control company. They found nothing. "Your place is clean," the guy said, shrugging. "Maybe the wind's just making the wooden beams creak." But I knew it wasn't. The scratching came from inside the walls, specifically from the far end of the hallway. It was always at night, around 3 a.m. The witching hour, as my abuela used to say. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I began waking up with the words still ringing in my ears. Not in Spanish, not even a language I understood, just soft, fast syllables, whispered in a voice that sounded too dry, too close. One night, I followed the sound. I crept toward the hallway, heart pounding, barefoot across cold tiles. The scratching had grown louder, more frantic, like something clawing to escape. And then, just as I reached the end of the hallway, it stopped, silence, until I saw the wall crack, a jagged little line, thin, like a hairline fracture. But I swear, for just a moment, something moved behind it. A shadow. Something hunched and twitching. The next morning, the crack was gone. I thought I was losing my mind. I barely slept. I became jumpy, paranoid, and I wasn't alone. My neighbors, normally friendly and talkative, avoided eye contact, and when I asked if they'd ever experienced anything strange in the area, they clammed up. Only Doña Graciela, the elderly woman who ran the small market near my street, finally spoke to me. She pulled me aside one evening, her face pale. "You live near El Muerto atrás de la pared," she whispered. "The dead behind the wall." I stared at her. What does that mean? She told me a story, one I wish I'd never heard. Long ago, that house belonged to a brujero, a male practitioner of black magic. He was feared by the community, known for curses, rituals, and sacrifice. They say he once sealed a spirit inside the house walls, a restless soul who refused to move on. Not a ghost, something twisted, something fed by pain, grief, and isolation. The house was cursed, abandoned for decades. Every person who lived there either fled or was found mad or dead, babbling about voices in the walls. I tried to dismiss it as folklore, just another urban legend. But then the dreams started again. Only now they weren't just whispers. They were images, vivid, blood-soaked visions. A man in robes chanting over bones. A girl screaming as hands reached from a wall to drag her into a fire. A laugh that echoed even after I woke. I packed my things. I wanted to leave, but the house, it wouldn't let. Doors slammed shut on their own. Windows jammed. Lights flickered and died. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, warping like a tunnel. I would walk toward the front door and somehow end up back at my bedroom. Then came the night I woke to find blood under my fingernail. I hadn't cut myself. I checked every inch of my body. No wounds, but the blood was real, fresh, thick, metallic smell. And worse, it wasn't mine. There were fingerprints smeared across the walls, tiny ones, like a child's hand had dragged along the paint. That was the night I heard it. Not a whisper, a clear, broken voice from behind the wall at the end of the hallway. "I'm still in here." I don't remember screaming, but I must have. My neighbor said she heard me, and when she came knocking the next morning, I was curled in the corner, covered in dirt and scratches, my eyes swollen from crying. She helped me leave. I moved across the city that same day. A few weeks later, I saw a news article. A construction crew had begun renovations on the old house. While tearing down the hallway wall, they found something. A sealed cavity. Inside was a small human skeleton, curled up in the fetal position, clutching something in its hands, a twisted bone charm, and a slip of faded cloth covered in writing. Police said it was just a tragic discovery, possibly an old crime. But I know better. The locals know. They tore the wall down. But sometimes, walls aren't what holds spirits in. Sometimes it's the land itself. And late at night, if you walk past that old house in San Andres Mixquic, they say you can still hear the scratching, still hear the whispers, because the thing in the wall never left, just moved closer. I've always loved wandering through old bookstores. There's something comforting about the smell of aged paper, the quiet hush of time standing still between cracked spines and handwritten notes in forgotten margins. So when I found a tiny bookstore tucked between a bakery and a hardware store in Colonia San Rafael, I couldn't resist stepping inside. There was no sign above the door, just a dusty glass window displaying faded first editions and a tiny bell that chimed eerily when I pushed open the creaky door. The shop was dimly lit, with towering bookshelves that stretched up to the cracked ceiling. The air smelled of paper and mildew. There was no music, no noise from the street outside, just silence, and the feeling that I had stepped into a different time. Behind the counter sat an old man, thin and hunched, wearing wire-framed glasses and a wool vest despite the heat. He barely looked up as I entered, simply muttering a low, "Bienvenido." I wandered between the shelves for a while, my fingers brushing along old bindings. That's when I found it. A black leather-bound book. No title, no author, no publisher. It was jammed awkwardly between a collection of Spanish poetry and a worn-out medical journal. Something about it pulled at me, like it had been waiting. I picked it up. The moment I touched the cover, I felt a faint jolt in my chest, like static electricity or dread. Inside, the pages were filled with handwritten text, written in neat, elegant cursive. But the language was strange. It wasn't Spanish. It wasn't Latin. It looked ancient. Symbols, glyphs, unfamiliar characters that twisted and danced before my eyes if I stared too. Still, I bought the book. I don't know why. The old man didn't ask questions. He just smiled as he wrapped it in brown paper and handed it to me with a raspy, "Cuídalo bien." That night, I placed the book on my bedside table. I didn't plan on reading it, not really. But sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up. The room was freezing, even though I hadn't touched the thermostat, and the book was open. It lay on the table, pages fluttering as if a breeze had passed through. But my window was closed. I slowly got out of bed and walked toward it. My breath caught when I saw the page it had opened to. There was a drawing, a detailed sketch of a figure, standing in a room that looked disturbingly like mine. Same bed, same walls. Even the lamp was identical. The figure in the drawing had no face, just a black void where its features should have been. Underneath the drawing, more of those strange symbols crawled across the page. I don't know how to explain it, but somehow I understood what it said. It sees you now. That night, I didn't sleep. The next few days were a blur of paranoia. Every time I passed a mirror, I thought I saw something behind me. Every time I blinked, I swore my room was slightly different. A shadow that hadn't been there before. A book that had moved an inch. One morning, I found a message scribbled on my bathroom mirror in condensation. Read more. I tried to get rid of the book. I left it on a park bench, walked away, even rode the metro across the city. When I got home, it was sitting on my desk, open to a new page. This time, there was another drawing, a figure standing at the foot of my bed. The caption beneath it said, "Soon." I started hearing noises at night, shuffling, scraping, breathing. My apartment grew colder. I stopped inviting friends over. Every time someone came, they said they felt watched or drained. One friend, Lucia, even passed out minutes after stepping into my bedroom. When she came to, she said she had dreamed of a faceless figure reaching out from my bookshelf, whispering nonsense in a horrible, gurgling voice. She refused to ever come back. I began seeing things in the corners of my eyes, flashes of movement, limbs too long, heads twisted at unnatural angles. I stopped leaving my apartment. The book seemed to pulse with life now. The cover would occasionally shift under my gaze, as though it were breathing. Then, one night, I gave in. I started reading it, page after page. I couldn't stop. The glyphs made sense now. The drawings grew darker, more violent, showing rituals, sacrifices, doorways to impossible places. And with every page I read, the shadows in my apartment deeper. I wasn't alone anymore. One night, I woke up to see it. The figure from the drawings, standing in the corner of my room. No face, just a churning void, absorbing the light around it. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It didn't touch me, just stood there, watching. When I finally screamed, it vanished, but its presence never left. I went back to the bookstore the next day, but the shop was gone. Just an empty lot, no bookstore, no old man, just a few bricks, weeds, and the scent of burned paper lingering in the air. I tried burning the book. It didn't catch fire. I tried drowning it. It stayed dry. Now every night I see the figure again, closer, watching, waiting, and the book, it's almost full. Just one page left blank, with a faint outline of a figure yet to be drawn. My shape, my bed, my face. I don't know what happens when it's finished, but I can feel something scratching at the edge of my mind, eager to take its place in the final chapter. And I know I made a mistake the day I picked it up. Some books aren't meant to be read. Some stories write themselves. I never believed that a few missing pesos could change everything. It began on an ordinary evening when I realized my wallet was empty. And not just empty, but mysteriously gone. That was 2 nights ago, and by the third night, a strange pull led me down an unfamiliar, shadowy alley behind my apartment in Condesa. The air was heavy and still as I stepped off the main street into a narrow passage bathed in an eerie, amber glow. There, as if conjured from the darkness itself, a marketplace. The market wasn't marked by neon lights or bustling voices. Instead, it was a labyrinth of makeshift stalls, draped in tattered cloth and illuminated by flickering candles. The vendors moved silently between the stalls. Their faces were hidden beneath deep hoods or carved masks, and their eyes, if they showed any, were too dark to read, like bottomless pits. Their voices, when they spoke, were soft and melodic, inviting me to peruse their curious wares. I felt drawn to this secret place, compelled by a mixture of desperate need and inexplicable fate. I wandered slowly, my senses overwhelmed by the surreal scene. Each stall offered items that defied ordinary explanation. Strange trinkets carved with ancient symbols, tiny boxes that pulsed with a faint light, and objects that seemed to whisper in voices too quiet to decipher. One stall in particular ensnared my attention. Draped in worn velvet, the stall displayed a small, ornate music box, crafted from dark, polished wood. Its surface was intricately carved with twisting designs that danced in the candlelight, forming symbols that unsettled me as much as they mesmerized. The faceless vendor regarded me with an unsettling calm. Without a word, he nodded and extended a hand toward the box. Despite every instinct screaming that something was off, I felt compelled to accept the object. I exchanged a crumpled bill, the only currency I had left, for the music box. The vendor's silence as I walked away was as heavy as the night, and the marketplace dissolved behind me into the inky black of the alley, leaving only a lingering scent of damp earth and decay. That night, I returned to my small apartment with the music box tucked under my arm. Once home, I carefully wound it up. The melody that began to play was hauntingly beautiful, a soft, sorrowful tune that filled every corner of my place. At first, the music offered comfort in the oppressive quiet, but as the nights passed, the tune grew more insistent, echoing through my dreams with a melancholy that bordered on despair. Soon after, unsettling changes began to occur in my home. My family, my mother and younger sister, seemed to fall under a strange, soporific spell. My sister would spend hours transfixed by the music box, her eyes distant, as if she were listening to a secret only she could understand. My mother, once vibrant and lively, now wandered the halls with a vacant expression, her gaze fixed on the empty air, as if waiting for something. At night, I started hearing faint whispers and soft shuffling sounds coming from the corners of our living room, sounds that grew louder whenever the music box played. One night, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere any longer, I followed the sound of my sister's quiet hum to her room. I found her seated by the music box, cradling it as if it were a living thing. In a trembling voice, she whispered, "It sings to me. It tells me secrets about the dark." I recoiled in horror, feeling that this object was no mere trinket. It was a vessel, a conduit for something malevolent. Desperate for answers, I returned to that secret alley under the cover of a moonless night. The marketplace reappeared, shrouded in an almost tangible aura of dread. I retraced my steps through the twisting rows of stalls until I found the one where I had bought the music box. The vendor was there, waiting silently. In his outstretched hand, he offered me a small, delicate pendant engraved with the same ancient symbols that adorned the music box. Against every instinct, I reached out and accepted the pendant, and in that moment, his voice, barely audible yet chilling, whispered, "Your soul is not free." I returned home clutching the pendant, feeling an overwhelming heaviness settle over me. In the days that followed, the music box's melody grew louder and more discordant, filling our home with an otherworldly lament. My mother's once warm eyes now shone with a ghostly light as she murmured in sleep, and my sister's silence became as deep as the night itself. The pendant, too, seemed to exert an unholy influence, pulsing with an energy that made my skin crawl. In a frantic bid to save my family, I sought help from an old priest, reputed to have seen things beyond mortal understanding. In the dim light of his modest chapel, he examined the music box and the pendant with trembling hands. "These are cursed relics," he declared in a hushed tone, "bound by a spirit that hungers for the life force of those who dare possess them. The marketplace you visited is no ordinary place. It trades not in money, but in souls." The priest performed a desperate ritual to break the bond between our family and these cursed objects. For a fleeting moment, hope flared in my chest as I watched him intone prayers and sprinkle holy water. But then, with a piercing shriek, the music box began to play on its own, its melody twisting into a harsh cacophony that drowned out all other sounds. The pendant glowed ominously, and the priest collapsed, his eyes rolling back in terror as he cried, "It is not so easily undone!" I returned home to a nightmare. In our living room, the music box played relentless, its tune echoing with the sorrow of countless lost souls. My mother sat motionless, and my sister's eyes were fixed on a void that I could not reach. In a final act of desperation, I locked the cursed relics in a box and hurled it into the depths of our basement, sealing it shut with concrete. Yet even as I did, the melody lingered, a persistent reminder of the bargain I had unwittingly made. Now, each night, as I lie awake in a silent home, I can almost feel the weight of that marketplace, its cursed wares, reaching out to claim what was left of my family's free will. I know that somewhere in the hidden alleys of this vast city, the faceless vendors await the next soul desperate enough to wander into the night. And I fear that despite my efforts, the darkness I invited into our home has not yet finished its work. Every so often in the quiet hours before dawn, I hear that haunting melody, a reminder that some bargains, once struck, can never be undone. I never believed in urban legends until the nights I began to hear the unearthly cries from the rooftop. It started subtly, a distant, drawn-out wail piercing the humid silence of midnight. I lived in an old building in the heart of Mexico City, where the thin walls and creaking fire escapes only deepened the mystery. At first, I assumed it was nothing more than a drunken shout or the wind whistling through forgotten vents. But night after night, the scream grew in intensity, agony and despair, echoing across the concrete courtyard. One humid evening, as I sat by my window trying to shake off sleep, the scream shattered the stillness. This time, it wasn't just a cry, it was a prolonged, anguished lament that seemed to vibrate right through my bones. Curiosity and fear battled within me until I finally decided to confront the source. I grabbed my flashlight and crept up the rickety fire escape to the building's flat, tar-black rooftop. The night was oppressively dark, with only a sliver of moonlight slicing across the cityscape. The rooftop was a desolate expanse of worn concrete, littered with broken pieces of glass and rusted metal. As I edged forward, my flashlight beam caught on a series of deep claw marks gouged into the cold surface, interspersed with streaks of dark, dried blood. My heart pounded louder than the distant sirens below. Then, from somewhere near the far end of the roof, the scream began again, this time closer and more desperate. I moved cautiously, every step echoing in the emptiness, until I reached a shadowed corner beneath a shattered light fixture. There, in the dim glow, I saw a vague silhouette, a gaunt, elongated figure standing near an old vent, its head tilted upward as if forever in the grip of excruciating sorrow. For a moment, the figure stood motionless, its presence a silent invitation and a warning all at once. I called out, voice trembling, "Hello? Who's there?" My words were swallowed by the vast night, and in return the figure seemed to waver, its form flickering like a mirage. Then, it raised its arms slowly, as if beckoning me closer, before dissolving into the darkness. In that instant, a dreadful realization. I wasn't witnessing a mere ghost. Something far more insidious was a creature that fed on grief, a predator that captured and mimicked the cries of the broken. Unable to shake the sensation of being watched, I circled around the edge of the rooftop. Each step revealed more unsettling evidence. A fresh smear of red near a corroded railing, more scratch marks that looked far too deliberate to be the work of animals. The cold wind carried a whisper of despair, and for a split second, I thought I heard my own name echo among the structures. My pulse quickened as a sudden gust of wind brushed past me, sending shivers down my spine. Then, in a moment of unbearable dread, I caught sight of something impossible in a shard of broken mirror that lay discarded. In its fractured reflection, I saw not only my own terrified, but also a second. My face twisted in a silent scream, eyes wide with unspoken horror. The two images stared back at each other as if sharing a secret too terrible to. I recoiled, my stomach twisting, a primal fear I'd never experienced. It was then that the creature's cries surged again, louder and more insistent, shaking the very concrete beneath my feet. In that agonizing crescendo, I felt my own scream build from deep within, a sound of terror that I never knew I could produce. And as it erupted from my throat, the sound was reflected back to me from the rooftop, a perfect, macabre echo of my own despair. The realization was unbearable. The creature had absorbed my anguish, transforming it into an eternal, looping wail that now belonged to both of us. I scrambled down the fire escape, every step laden with the weight of that horrid sound echoing in my ear. Even now, safe within the relative confines of my apartment, I can still recall the feeling of those chilling vibrations, as if the very air was steeped in sorrow. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the city is at its most vulnerable, I swear I hear that relentless cry, a reminder that some horrors refuse to be left behind. Every time I pass a window or glimpse a reflection, I sense a presence lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting to share another scream, a scream that may one day become my own. I used to think that working in a morgue would desensitize me to death. I had been a pathology assistant in Mexico City for 4 years, and I believed I had seen it all. Burn victims, decomposed corpses, gruesome autopsies, but nothing prepared me for the night a body came in without a name, without a file, and without a cause of death. It was just there, a pale, emaciated man wrapped in a filthy cloth sheet, delivered in the middle of the night with a forged transfer order, and no one to claim him. The strange part wasn't just the anonymity of the body. It was the condition. It was no wounds, no visible trauma, but its face was twisted in the most horrifying expression of fear I had ever seen. Mouth agape, eyes wide and bloodshot, as if whatever had taken him in his final moments had been far worse than pain. It sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. Paperwork first, emotions later. I wheeled him into Chamber 3, the coldest room in the facility. The others were full that night. Something about the temperature felt wrong as soon as I entered. Too cold, even by morgue standards. Frost crept along the inside of the steel drawers and clung to my fingertip. I chalked it up to overcompensation by the cooling system and slid the body inside a drawer, locking it shut. As I turned to leave, I felt a subtle vibration beneath my feet, like a soft hum echoing through the floor tiles. The rest of the night was routine until around 2 a.m., when the security lights flickered and the emergency alarm gave a soft beep, the kind it made during power surges. I checked the control panel, but everything appeared normal. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. I walked the perimeter of the morgue, flashlight in hand, and when I passed Chamber 3, I froze. The drawer I had locked earlier was slightly ajar. I approached slowly, breath catching in my throat. I could hear something inside, soft, irregular thumping, like fingers tapping against metal from within. My hand hovered over the drawer's handle, unsure whether to pull it open or run. Then the tapping stopped, and something far worse took its place. Breathing. Shallow, raspy, ragged breathing from inside the drawer. My hand trembled as I backed away. Logic screamed that it was impossible, but instinct told me otherwise. The man was dead, wasn't he? I ran to the security office and pulled up the surveillance feed for Chamber 3. What I saw still haunts me. In the grainy black and white footage, the drawer slid open on its own, and the corpse, still contorted in that awful expression, sat upright. It didn't move like a person. It jerked, like something unfamiliar with how bodies work, as though something was puppeteering the corpse from inside. The figure stood swayed awkwardly, and slowly turned its head toward the camera. Even through the static, I saw its eyes move, slowly, deliberately, locking onto mine through the monitor. I must have blacked out. When I came to, it was daylight, and my supervisor was shaking me awake in the security room. I tried to explain what I saw, but the footage was gone, replaced with a loop from the previous night showing nothing out of the ordinary. The body, I was told, had vanished. No signs of tampering, no exit logs, just an empty drawer and a note left behind on my workstation. It wasn't written on paper. It was scratched into the metal surface of my desk with what looked like fingernails. "I'm not done with you." I left my job that day, but that wasn't the end of it. Since then, I've seen that expression in other places, on strangers on the street, reflected in passing windows, even in dreams. That twisted face of terror, mouth stretched in an eternal scream, eyes brimming with unnatural fear. Every so often, I wake to the sound of soft tapping beneath my bed or in the closet, and I'm reminded that death doesn't always mean rest. Sometimes it means something far worse is still watching, still waiting in the cold. I had just moved into my new apartment in the Tlatelolco district of Mexico City. The price was suspiciously low, but I chalked it up to luck and the old age of the building. It had a strange charm to it. Worn tile floors, high ceilings, and a small balcony that overlooked a cracked courtyard. I was trying to start over after a terrible breakup and thought solitude would be healing. But what I found in that apartment wasn't peace. It was something that would tear at my sanity night after night. From the very first evening, there was a strange feeling in the air, like static clinging to my skin. The neighbors were quiet, too quiet. I hardly saw anyone in the hallways, and when I did, they avoided eye contact, rushing past me as if I didn't exist. One old woman across the hall would simply stand in her doorway at night, staring down the corridor without moving. I tried not to think too much about it, blaming it on paranoia and stress. But then the knocking started. It came precisely at 3:17 a.m. every night. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on my front door. The first time, I thought it was a prank. I looked through the peephole. No one. I opened the door. Nothing. The hallway was empty and still. But the pattern repeated the next night. Same time, same slow knocks. No one there. I even set up a camera app on my phone and left it running all night. But when I reviewed the footage, there was a strange static distortion exactly at 3:17 a.m. For 5 seconds before this video resumed. I began losing sleep. I taped notes on the door, demanding that whoever was messing with me stop. I even left it open one, hoping to catch them in the act. But that night, the knocks came from inside the apartment, from the bedroom wall. That's when I noticed the outline of a sealed door behind my wardrobe. The plaster was uneven, if it had been hastily covered up. My curiosity got the better of me, and I spent the next day chipping away at it. Behind the drywall was an old wooden door with a rusted metal handle. It reeked of mold and decay. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Behind the door was a narrow staircase leading downward, impossibly downward. I lived on the second floor. There should have been nothing beneath me but the first floor apartment. Yet this staircase twisted far below into pitch blackness. I stood there, flashlight in hand, calling out into the void. No answer, but I felt something, a shift in the air, a low whisper I couldn't quite understand. I closed the door and sealed it back up that night, but it wasn't enough. The knocks didn't stop. They got louder, more aggressive, and soon I started hearing whispers in the walls, a wet, rasping voice calling my name from the hidden stairwell. One night, I woke up to find the door to the secret staircase wide open, though I had sealed it shut, and standing at the top of the stairs was a figure, tall, thin, unnaturally still, cloaked in shadows, with eyes that gleamed like wet glass in the dark. I ran out of the apartment that night, barefoot and shaking, and slept in a cheap motel. When I returned the next day, the landlord was waiting for me, angry that I'd broken the wall. I demanded to know what was behind the staircase, but he only muttered something about La Puerta del Silencio, the door of silence. He refused to explain further and told me the last tenant disappeared without a trace. I didn't go back. I left everything behind in that apartment and moved across the city, but I still wake at 3:17 a.m., heart racing, ears straining for that knock. Sometimes I hear it faintly, even here, in my new place. Just 3 slow raps in the dead of night. And sometimes I dream of the staircase, of descending step by step into that suffocating darkness, where whispers grow louder and the walls close in, and at the bottom, something waits with open arms and hollow eyes. I fear one day I won't wake from that. I had always been drawn to forgotten places, abandoned buildings, crumbling ruins, and weathered relics of the past. It was more than a hobby, it was an escape. As a photographer in Mexico City, I found beauty in decay. It was during one of these excursions that I stumbled upon the old San Esteban Hospital, hidden behind overgrown fences and swallowed by the weeds of time. It hadn't appeared on any of my maps, but the structure loomed in the distance like it had always been there, waiting. The building was skeletal, a shell of its former self. Windows were shattered, tiles broken, vines wrapped tightly around its stone pillars like veins. I crawled in through a side window, camera slung over my shoulder, eager to capture the forgotten sadness etched into its walls. Inside, the silence was deafening. Dust motes floated in beams of sunlight that pierced through cracks in the roof. Medical equipment lay rusted and strewn across the halls, and wheelchairs sat tipped over as if someone had fled in haste. I moved through the corridors, snapping photos, but my excitement dulled the moment I stepped into the old maternity wing. There was something wrong there, something heavy in the air, thick like molasses. The hallway was lined with peeling baby blue tiles, and down the center was a row of bassinets, untouched by time but unnaturally clean, like someone had recently wiped them down. I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My breath fogged as I reached for my camera to photograph the eerie hallway. That's when I heard it, a faint lullaby. It was old, haunting, sung in a whisper by a voice I couldn't locate. I followed the sound, heart pounding, until I reached one of the delivery rooms. Inside, the walls were smeared with faded red handprints, small, childlike ones, and in the corner, barely visible in the gloom, was an incubator with something moving inside. I thought I was hallucinating. I crept closer, certain it was just a rat or shadow. But as I lifted my camera and took a photo, the flash revealed a face pressed against the incubator's glass. A baby, but not like any I'd ever seen. Its skin was bluish, bloated, and its eyes were milky white. It opened its mouth in a silent wail, and then the incubator tipped over violently on its own, smashing into the wall. I turned and ran, but the hospital didn't let me go so easily. Corridors twisted impossibly, leading me in circles. Doors I'd come through minutes earlier were now bricked over, and behind every corner, that lullaby grew louder, more distorted. I began to see things. Nurses with blood-soaked uniforms flickering in and out of existence, a doctor dragging a body bag across the hall, a woman screaming in a birthing bed while no one helped her. I must have wandered for hours. I don't know how I eventually escaped. I remember stumbling out of a back door and collapsing in the street, covered in dust and bruises. But the worst part wasn't what I saw. It was what I brought with me. When I got home and looked at my camera, every photo was corrupted, except one, the photo from the incubator room. The baby's face was clear, too clear, and behind it, in the reflection of the glass, was mine. But it wasn't me taking the picture. It was me, standing over the incubator, dressed in the same bloodied uniform as the nurses in the hospital, staring back at myself with hollow eyes. Since then, I've been having blackouts. Hours disappear from my day, with no explanation. Sometimes I wake up with dirt under my nails or find old, rusted medical tools in my backpack that I don't remember picking up. I think the hospital never really let me go. I think a part of it followed me home, and late at night when I'm half asleep, I swear I can hear that lullaby playing softly from the other room. I had never believed in curses. I thought they were just remnants of folklore, stories passed down to scare children or add mystique to the past. But that changed the day I purchased a small, ornate mask from a street vendor in La Lagunilla Market, one of the oldest and most chaotic bazaars in Mexico City. The vendor was an old man with cloudy eyes and trembling hands. His stall was a mess of trinkets, rusted keys, chipped dolls, cracked mirrors. But the mask caught my attention immediately. It was made of aged wood, with twisted carvings resembling a human face frozen in an expression of anguish, eyes sunken, mouth stretched open as if caught in a silent scream. The paint had mostly faded except for those red streaks around the eyes and lips. "How much for the mask?" I asked. The vendor stared at me for a long time before saying, "It doesn't want a price. It wants a host." I laughed awkwardly, assuming he was just trying to be dramatic. He placed it in a thin paper bag and refused to take any money. "Just don't hang it where it can see you sleep," he warned. That night, I ignored his advice and hung it on the wall above my bed. The nightmares began almost immediately. In my dreams, I wandered through endless alleyways that twisted and curved like a labyrinth, lit only by flickering candles. I would hear whispers all around me, hollow, childlike voices chanting something I couldn't understand. Each time I turned a corner, I saw the mask floating in the air, staring at me with lifeless, red-ringed eyes. But the dreams weren't the worst part. It was the things happening while I was awake. At first, I thought I was just misplacing things. My keys would vanish and reappear in the freezer. My books would fall from the shelves. The lights would flicker at exactly 3:03 a.m. every night. Then, I began seeing the mask in places I didn't leave it. On the kitchen table, the bathroom sink, even my pillow. I would swear I had hung it back on the wall, but it never stayed there. Its expression seemed to change too. Each time, it looked more twisted, more animated, like it was slowly coming to life. One night, I woke up gasping for breath. It felt like something was pressing against my chest. When I opened my eyes, the mask was inches from my face, hovering in the air, slowly rotating, staring down at me. I screamed and threw it across the room, but when I turned on the light, it was back on the wall, unmoved. I tried to get rid of it. I threw it into a dumpster miles from my apartment, but it returned the next day, sitting neatly on my doorstep. I smashed it with a hammer, only to find it whole again the next morning. I even burned it in a fire pit, but the flames wouldn't touch it. The fire bent away unnaturally, refusing to consume it. I turned to research, desperate for answers. I found references to similar masks in old Nahua ritual, used by shamans to summon the Silencio Rojo, a malevolent spirit that feeds on fear and slowly wears down its victim's identity, replacing them from the inside out. I was already changing. I stopped recognizing myself in the mirror. My voice began to sound distant. My dreams became more vivid, longer, darker. I couldn't remember what I had done for hours at a time. And then, one day, I found photographs in my camera roll. Photos I had no memory of taking. They were of people, strangers. Each photo showed them sleeping in their homes, the flash illuminating their terrified faces, with the mask placed on their bedside table. I don't know what's happening. I feel like I'm becoming a passenger in my own body. I've started speaking in a language I don't recognize. And when I sleep, I wake up covered in dirt and old blood I can't explain. I tried locking the mask in a box and burying it in a construction site nearby. But last night I woke up holding it in my hands. It was smiling. Yes, smiling. Its mouth had shifted slightly, curved into a grotesque grin. I don't think it's feeding on me anymore. I think it's finished. And now, I think it's wearing me. I'd always considered myself a rational person. I didn't believe in the supernatural ghost stories or whispered legends passed down through generations. But all of that shattered the night I agreed to house sit for my friend Mateo in the Xochimilco district of Mexico City. Mateo's family owned an old, colonial-style house just off one of the less touristy canals. It was beautiful and haunting, weathered red bricks, creaking wooden floors, and massive windows covered with thick antique curtains. He'd inherited it after his grandmother passed, and though he didn't like staying there, he needed someone to keep an eye on the place while he traveled for a week. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it, a strange pressure in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. Mateo brushed it off, joking that it was just old house vibes. Before he left, he warned me about one thing. Don't open the door at the end of the hall on the second floor. He said it had always been stuck anyway, but his grandmother used to say it was a room that should never see the night again. I laughed it off, assuming it was just a quirky family superstition. The first 2 nights were quiet, though I noticed strange sounds. Floorboards creaked even when I wasn't moving. The walls occasionally groaned like they were shifting under invisible weight, but I blamed it on age and old plumbing. It wasn't until the third night that things began to feel wrong. It started with the whispers. They came from upstairs, soft, muffled voices that would drift down the staircase late at night. When I went up to check, the hallway would be empty. The only door I hadn't opened was the one Mateo told me to avoid. I found myself standing in front of it one night, hand hovering over the knob. It wasn't stuck anymore. I didn't open it. Not yet. But I started noticing things around the house. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. A dining chair was dragged halfway across the room. One morning, I found all the curtains in the house tied in knots. Then, I started finding muddy footprints on the stairs, barefoot, small, like those of a child. I tried calling Mateo, but his phone went straight to voicemail. By the fifth night, I was barely sleeping. That night, the whispers turned into voices, louder, clearer, pleading. I was lying on the couch downstairs when I heard someone call my name from the second floor. Not a whisper this time, a child's voice, trembling. I finally gave in. I went upstairs and opened the door. The room was freezing, the air thick with dust and the scent of rotting flowers. It was a child's bedroom. The furniture looked untouched by time. Tiny bed, old toys, faded drawings on the wall. A cracked photo frame sat on the nightstand, showing a young boy I didn't recognize. The only thing out of place was the dark stain on the floor in the shape of a body, like someone had bled out and never been found. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the boy in the photo, about the voice I heard. The next evening, as I walked past the room, I saw something inside, a shadow moving just slightly, brushing past the bed. I stepped in, flashlight shaking in my hand. The toy chest in the corner was open. Inside it was a child's diary. The entries were heartbreaking. A boy named Tomas had lived there, neglected and locked away by his family. He wrote about voices that spoke to him from the shadows, voices that promised him love if he just let them in. The final entry chilled me to my bones. They said they'll make me part of the house, that I'll never be alone again. That night, everything changed. I saw him, a small boy, standing at the foot of my bed, pale, his eyes entirely black. His mouth didn't move, but I heard his voice inside my head, whispering, pleading, weeping. He didn't want to hurt me. He just didn't want to be forgotten. But there was something behind, something worse. A tall, faceless figure looming in the corner of the room, its fingers elongated, twitching. I left the house before sunrise, abandoning everything. I haven't seen Mateo since. His house sits empty now, boarded up, and no one in the neighborhood talks about it. Some say it's cursed. Others say the boy's spirit still wanders, waiting for someone to listen. But late at night, I still hear his voice sometimes. I wake up with that cold, empty feeling, like something standing in the dark just beyond my door. And I keep wondering, what if I had never opened that door? But a deeper part of me whispers something more terrifying. What if I didn't free him, but invited him out? It's been nearly a year since I left Mexico City, yet I still wake up in cold sweats, haunted by what I experienced in the neighborhood of Tlatelolco. I haven't told anyone the full story until now. Maybe writing it out will finally give me peace, or maybe it'll just confirm that I've gone insane. But I need to get it out of me before whatever followed me decides to finish what it started. Back then, I was a freelance writer, constantly moving between cheap rentals while working on local human interest stories. I landed a temporary apartment in one of the towering buildings near Plaza de las Tres Culturas, concrete giants left over from the 60s, their walls soaked in history, tragedy, and something else I couldn't quite name. The rent was cheap, the location perfect, and the agent made no mention of why the previous tenant had broken the lease early. From the first night, the building felt wrong. Not just old, wrong. The elevator creaked and stopped at random floors, even when no one was inside. Hall lights flickered, but not in the usual faulty wiring way, more like they were reacting to something moving unseen. My apartment was on the 11th floor. The view was stunning, but I never felt alone, not even with the doors locked and the windows shut. It started with the knocking. Every night at exactly 2:17 a.m., I'd hear a faint, rhythmic knock on my door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. At first, I thought it was a neighbor playing a prank, but whenever I opened the door, the hallway would be empty, utterly silent, the kind of silence that presses on your skull. Then came the smell, a sickening mix of earth and rot, like freshly dug soil and something dead buried beneath it. It would come in waves, drifting through the vents, filling my lungs until I could barely breathe. I asked around the building, but no one else smelled it. At least, that's what they said. Some neighbors avoided eye contact when I asked. Others simply shut their doors without a word. The nightmares followed. In them, I'd stand in the hallway, naked and freezing, staring down the corridor toward the stairwell. A woman would appear at the end, pale, gaunt, hair hanging like a veil across her face. She'd walk toward me slowly, dragging one foot behind her, her head twitching at unnatural angles. But I could never move. I'd just stand there, paralyzed, until she was inches from me, and then I'd wake up gasping, heart pounding, sweat pouring from my body like I'd run a marathon. But then I started seeing her when I was awake. At first, it was just glimpses, reflections in windows, the flicker of movement behind me in mirrors, a silhouette at the end of the hallway that vanished when I blinked. Then, she began getting bolder. One night, I found muddy footprints, leading from my front door to my bed. My windows hadn't been opened. My door was still locked from the inside. But the footprints were unmistakable, small, bare feet, caked in wet earth. That same night, I woke up to the sound of whispering inside my apartment. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew it wasn't just the The next day, I finally confronted the building's janitor. He was an old man with deep wrinkles and hollow eyes. I begged him to tell me what was going on. He sighed and looked down. "There are things here that never left," he said quietly. "This place is built on bones." He told me the building was constructed on top of ancient Aztec ruins, and later the site of the Tlatelolco massacre, where hundreds of students were gunned down by the government in 1968. "Too much death in one place," he said. "Too many souls wandering without peace." I wanted to leave immediately, but I couldn't find another place in time. That night, I packed my bags and tried to ignore the dread crawling through my skin. I decided I'd sleep with the lights on, one last night. But she didn't care about light. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the knocking came again. 3 knocks. But this time, I didn't answer. This time, the door opened on its own. She walked in. Her body was broken, spine twisted unnaturally, bones cracking with every movement. Her eyes were hollow sockets, but I swear I could feel her gaze, deep, heavy, soul-draining. She stood at the foot of my bed, staring, twitching, and then she whispered something I'll never forget. "You took my place." I screamed and passed out. When I woke, it was morning. The door was shut. No footprints, no smell, just the silence. I fled the apartment within the hour, breaking my lease, leaving everything behind. I moved far from the city, hoping to outrun the shadow that had clung to me in that place. But sometimes, I still hear it. 3 knocks, faint, rhythmic, at exactly 2:17 a.m. No matter where I go,